Elias was a simple man who lived alone on the edge of a small village. He had no family after losing both his parents and his younger brother to the Black Death in years previous. The way the disease ripped through his family and friends was like nothing he'd seen. It had left him to live a simple but lonely life in his handmade, humble abode. Evenings were spent sat warming by the fire, lost in his own thoughts, and days spent hunting for meat and growing his vegetables. Sometimes he would go weeks without seeing another soul, given the low numbers of people left within the area. It was a crisp autumn morning, and first light pierced through the canopy of trees that surrounded Elias's home. He stepped onto his porch, wooden boards creaking under his weight. Unshaven and in thought, he surveyed the area around him. One thing that the Black Death could never take away was the beauty of the area in which he lived. Elias took a deep breath and turned to go back inside to prepare for the day's hunt when something caught his eye. Approaching it and picking it up, Elias examined the object, which was a small, intricately crafted doll. It was a very peculiar find, given how rare it was to see anyone near his home. He continued to examine the object. The doll's face bore a serene expression, its eyes a striking shade of green that seemed almost lifelike. Clad in a faded dress of lace and silk, it exuded an air of ingenuity. Somewhat puzzled, Elias scanned the surrounding forest, half expecting to see a wandering child or a traveler who might have dropped the doll, someone who had considered knocking on his door but had changed their mind. But the woods remained silent, offering no clues and no answers. With a shake of the head, Elias took the object inside and placed it on a shelf above the fireplace, its glassy eyes now overseeing the room. Part of him hoped that whoever had left the doll would return to collect it, as it didn't seem altogether undesirable to share the company of another, if only for a short time. Days passed, and the cabin's atmosphere began to shift subtly. Elias couldn't help but feel that the doll brought a faint energy with it, and it was almost as if he didn't quite feel as alone as he had before its arrival. He was, of course, alone, but when he returned home from his daily hunting trips, it felt as if he was walking into a place filled with another soul. And at first, he quite liked the feeling. It was somehow comforting. But as the days continued to pass, the pleasant feeling of company began to shift into more eerie territory. It began with faint noises, soft whispers that seemed to emanate from the air around him, or the sound of slow, heavy footsteps in the hallway when Elias was sitting in front of the fire, knowing he was alone. At first, he dismissed the sounds as figments of his imagination, or the natural sounds of the old cabin settling. However, as the weeks passed, nobody came to claim the doll. The disturbance grew more pronounced. One evening, while reading, with the dim glow of an oil lamp, Elias caught a fleeting movement in his peripheral vision. He turned his head sharply, but the room appeared as it always did, except for the doll. It seemed to have shifted slightly, its head tilted at an angle, its eyes now gazing directly at him, as if it was analyzing him. A sense of unease began to grip Elias, but he reasoned it away, attributing it to his own actions and the fact he had been drinking. It was a concoction he had developed over the years, and although the taste left a lot to be desired, it seemed to do the trick and removed him slightly from reality. And that was what he needed on the long, cold, lonely nights. Perhaps in his drunken state, he had knocked the doll somehow and caused it to fall to the side. That was the thought process he decided to go with. Yet, as the nights wore on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. Sounds grew louder, and the movements of the little doll became more obvious. Elias then began to experience vivid nightmares. He dreamt of wandering through the forest, pursued by a shadowy figure whose presence filled him with dread. Each time he awoke, drenched in sweat, the doll's eyes always seemed to be focused on him, gleaming with a malevolent light, as if mocking his terror. One afternoon when Elias had returned from a rather successful hunting trip, he decided to take the doll outside and get rid of it. He trekked into the nearby woodland and happened upon a brook. Taking a good drink of the cold water to help ease the headache left by the previous night's alcohol, Elias threw the doll into the brook and watched it slowly float away. He then turned and began to head home. The autumn sun was not far from setting, and so his footsteps quickened as the woodland began to darken within each passing minute. Elias stopped. It was the sound of something moving around in the water. Only the volume and depth of the noise told him it was something much more substantial than a small doll. He turned and looked back to where he had just been, but the increasing absence of light meant he couldn't make much out of anything. He did, however, think he could see the doll, sat up against a fallen tree near the brook. Elias turned and began to run. The following morning, Elias opened the front door of his home to find the little doll once again lying on the porch, dirty, damp, and on its back, looking up at him. He picked it up and was at that point certain there were unnatural forces at work. Determined to uncover the truth, Elias decided to try and investigate the doll's origin. He ventured into the nearest town, a journey that took the better part of the day. There was a woman who dwelt there, known locally as Madame Rune. Some said she was a white witch, others just said she had spent many lifetimes studying the supernatural. Either way, she was a local legend, and Elias knew she would be the person to help shed some light on his predicament, if anyone could. After arriving at Madame Rune's home and offering her a bag of food for her service, Elias sat at the table. The candles lit up the room, and the woman took her time examining the doll. "I once heard," she said finally, "that a doll matching this description was crafted by a grieving mother who lost her daughter to the forest many years ago. Well, it was not the forest which took her. It was a man she happened across. And that evil man acted out his darkest fantasies, and the poor girl was made to suffer horribly at his hands. The man then went to the next village, got blind drunk, and shared his story with a stranger, and that in turn led to the discovery of the girl's body, a body which suggested every evil little detail he had shared was true. Consumed by sorrow, the girl's mother carried out a ritual and imbued the doll with her child's spirit, hoping to keep her memory alive. But something went wrong. The doll became a vessel for something darker, which used the opening to its advantage, an opportunity to bridge the gap between two worlds. I can't tell you how to rid yourself of this doll, Elias, for if it is I suspect, then its power far outweighs my own." After thanking the woman, but feeling that hope was lost, worried Elias returned to his cabin, the old woman's words echoing in his mind. Scared to get rid of the doll, yet scared to keep it, he decided to take it back into his home until he could figure out what it wanted, or what was best to do so not to incur its wrath. That night, the disturbances escalated substantially. Objects moved on their own. Doors creaked open and then banged shut, and the temperature plummeted, his breath visible in the frigid air. As he lay in bed, terrified, Elias heard a soft, melodic humming. It was a lullaby, one he had never heard before, yet it filled him with an inexplicable sadness. He turned his head slowly towards the shelf to see the doll was no longer there. Panic surged through him. He sat up, scanning the room, and froze. The doll was sat at the bottom of his bed, its green eyes focused directly on him. Elias jumped out of the bed, the air around him like ice. He grabbed the doll and went towards the fireplace, which, although had done very little to warm his home, still burned. He tossed the doll into the fire and then stoked the flames so that he could watch the thing burn, and burn it did. But as the flames engulfed it, a scream began to echo within the fireplace, and grew louder as the doll began to squirm. At first, Elias thought it was just the object changing shape due to whatever material it was made up of, melting, but he soon saw that the doll moved in an almost human fashion, and that faint screaming continued until the doll finally became still, burnt, and shriveled to almost nothing. Elias gazed into the fire, his mind trying to make sense of what he'd seen and heard. It was then he noticed a thick smoke, darker than that which had been created by the flames, and it began to slowly drift out towards him. Elias moved back as the black smoke neared him, but it then seemed to stop giving chase and began to swirl in front of him, randomly at first, but then it found a set path, and it shifted and moved to create a towering form, a figure, tall and imposing, and although the smoke never created what looked like a solid surface, two piercing eyes did make themselves known, and they looked down at Elias, and were soon joined by a mouth. A sound then arose, a deep laugh, which seemed to shake the wooden boards beneath his feet. Elias turned to run, but his arm instantly felt in the grip of something, and its force and power far outmatched his own. But it was when he looked down to his arm, and whatever held him, that his blood ran cold. His hand had started to lose its shape. It seemed rounded off. His legs then gave way. and Elias found himself lying on his back, his arm in the air as it was still in the creature's grip. But it did not look like his arm. It looked soft, and his skin seemed to have changed from that of human flesh to something which looked like cotton. And as he slipped away into shock, he couldn't help but feel that he was becoming more insignificant by the second, getting smaller. When Elias awoke, he was outside, looking up at a wooden shelter which seemed to belong to a gigantic house. He could not move a muscle. In fact, it felt like his body housed no muscle. Elias then watched as a closed door began to open, and a woman appeared, old and frail. Yet to him, she looked enormous. The woman looked around, surveying the area, before she seemed to notice him, and she gazed and squinted at him for a few seconds, in which times Elias tried to scream, but nothing worked. The will was there, but the physical ability was not. The old lady then bent slowly and picked him up with ease, before studying him. She looked curious. "Now who do you belong to?" she asked. The woman then smiled, turned, carried him inside, closing the door behind her in order to keep the cold out, yet having no idea what she'd allowed in. Tommy Grayson had always been a cruel man. His venomous words and heavy hands had left scars, both mental and physical, on many people throughout his life, not least his wife of 15 years, Elenor. Throughout their time together, she'd suffered his abuse silently, trapped in the cage of their marriage by fear, but also by love. Those were the two powerful feelings that helped her endure him, kept her pushing on even when feeling physical and mentally broken. But everyone's endurance has its limits. Finally, one cold October evening, a truly heartbroken Elenor took her own life after a brutal altercation with her husband. He'd beaten her black and blue after coming home from drinking at the local bar to find the meal she had prepared was not what he'd asked for. The punches and kicks barely registering as she had become accustomed to them. When she felt her ribs crack under the weight of the blows, something else snapped, something inside her mind. She began imagining what it would be like to finally find peace, and later that night, she sought it. Tommy was heartbroken after finding her body, and being a man who always wore his heart on his sleeve, everyone could clearly see how distraught he was. But the people in the small town also knew what had been going on in that home, and most formed the same opinion as to why she had taken her own life. The whispers and gossip haunted Tommy more than any formal charges could have. People would ignore him when they crossed paths in the street, and his trips to the local bar became more and more solitary, as Tommy would find himself sat at the bar without anyone to speak to. He soon found himself feeling very alone. The guilt, however faint, was a shadow in his mind. Still, he carried on, drinking himself into a stupor most nights and stumbling through his days. It was a cycle of drink, anger, and tears that seemed as though it might never end. That was until the doll arrived. Elena's aunt, Beatrice, had never liked Tommy, and she had never tried to hide the fact from him either. Her disdain for the man was always evident, as was her frustration with Elenor, who always tried to protect her husband when her aunt had tried to give her some hard truths. Beatrice was a quirky individual, with her veils, incense, and strange trinkets. Some said she was a witch, but she dismissed such talk with a raspy laugh and a wave of her bony hand. Tommy had been somewhat taken aback the day she arrived on his doorstep, a couple of weeks after Elenor's death. He offered her inside and made her a drink, and she didn't try to hide her disgust at how he'd let the apartment get. And she didn't try to hide her disgust at how he'd let the house get. Unclean and unkempt, much like the appearance of Tommy himself. With her, she brought a box wrapped in faded fabric, her eyes not leaving his when she finally handed it over. "What's this?" Tommy grunted, a glass of whiskey trembling in his big hand. "For ELENOR'S ashes," Beatrice said simply. Her voice was cold, yet there was something almost gleeful in her tone. They deserve a home. Elenor always had a fascination with dolls, ever since she was a child, and what a beautiful little girl she was. Tommy hesitated for a second before slowly opening the box. Inside it was a rag doll, if one could even call it that. It was somewhat grotesque. The doll's head was oversized, with bulging, uneven button eyes and a twisted grin stitched to its face. The fabric used for its skin was a pale, patchy cloth, and its long limbs were stuffed unevenly, giving it a gangly, distorted look. The hair, matted black yarn, fell in uneven strands around its face, but even though it caused Tommy to grimace, it somehow bore an uncanny resemblance to Elenor, albeit a rather warped, caricatured version of her. "It's horrible," Tommy said quietly, as he sat looking at the doll. "Respect her, Thomas," Beatrice said sharply. "Place her ashes inside the compartment at the front. It would have made her happy. Give her the peace and death you refused to grant her in life." Tommy's head snapped up. What the hell is that supposed to mean? But Beatrice just held his gaze for a few moments before looking away. Soon after that, Beatrice was gone, leaving the doll and an unsettling atmosphere in her wake. At first, Tommy shoved the doll into a corner, refusing to touch it. He simply continued with his daily routine of drinking too much, sleeping too much, and cleaning too little. And there were moments when he would stand, his innards drowning in whiskey, and speak to the doll, as if expecting an answer. But of course, the reply never came. As the days dragged on, the house began to feel more and more oppressive. The silence seemed to scream at him, filling the void Elenor had once occupied. Guilt began to gnaw at him, a constant, biting presence. But then, in typical Tommy fashion, he would justify his actions, blaming her just as much as himself, if not more so. One evening, after too many drinks, Tommy took the doll from its corner and stared at it. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice slurring. "It was your fault. You wouldn't listen. You never listened. Why did you make me hurt you?" The doll, of course, offered no response. But as Tommy stared at it, he thought that its unsettling grin seemed just a little wider in the flickering candlelight. Against his better judgment, Thomas retrieved the small urn containing Eleanor's ashes and, with trembling hands, poured them into the compartment in the front of the doll. He then sealed it shut before placing the doll on the mantel above the fireplace. "There. You're home now, babe," he said, with tears in his eyes. "Happy now?" That night, he dreamed of Elenor for the first time in months. In the dream, the two of them were sitting having breakfast, the room silent, other than the soft clicking of cutlery hitting the plate as they ate. But then there came the awful sound of a fork being scratched against a plate repeatedly. Tommy winced and looked up, about to shout at the woman who sat opposite. But when he did, looking back at him was not the face of his wife. Her eyes were too large, and her grin was too wide, with teeth all too long. She continued to scratch the plate in front of her while staring at him, eyes bulging. She then stopped, and in a voice that in no way resembled hers, she said, "Thank you for bringing me back." From that night on, the doll became a fixture in Tommy's life. He began talking to it, confessing things he would never admit sober, things she had no idea about, mainly regarding other women he'd been intimate with, but also about drugs and secret gambling. "I wish we could do it all again, but differently," he murmured one evening. "I could be a better man, and you could be a better woman, and you'd listen to me more. There would be no need for me to teach you those painful lessons. We could be happy." The doll, which was usually placed somewhere near him, just glared back. Its stitched grin looked almost sympathetic. One evening, after having another one-sided conversation with the doll, Tommy sat staring at it and thought it somehow looked a little different. He was certain that its button eyes gleamed brighter, reflecting the flickering light of the candle. He thought he could sense something, as if it was finally listening to him. The grin seemed a little less. He sensed sorrow, but then, with a shake of the head, Tommy laughed, as he realized the doll was just the same as it had always been. and he had drank far too much of the bottle of whiskey in his hand. As the days passed, he stopped bothering to sleep in his bed, and instead began sleeping on the couch, drinking himself into slumber. The doll would be propped up in the chair across from him, and he'd begun to find its presence strangely comforting, a silent companion to ease his growing isolation. It felt as if the least part of Elenor was there, so as the nights passed, he would place it on the chair and put a blanket over its legs. As he lay on the sofa under the duvet, he'd speak to the doll, sometimes telling it stories or going over the few pleasant memories the couple had shared, and other times he began to berate the doll, spittle flying from his mouth as he hurled abuse at it. Afterwards he'd apologize, but would always justify his actions, just as he had when his wife had been alive. This continued night after night, until the night he woke up and found it wasn't sitting in the chair. Tommy awoke to the sound of something moving. His eyes, blurred with sleep and whiskey, darted to the chair where the doll should have been, but the chair was empty. Confusion fused with panic prickled at the edges of his mind. He scanned the room, his breath quickening. "Ellie?" he whispered, the name slipping out before he realized it. A soft creak came from the kitchen. He got to his feet, and he walked slowly toward the sound. He entered the kitchen, which was dark, save for the pale moonlight streaming through the window, and there, standing in the center of the room, with its back to him, was the doll. But it wasn't the same. It had grown. The once baby-sized rag doll stood almost 7 feet tall, its gangly limbs dangling, its back hunched, head stooped in order to fit under the low ceiling. Tommy wondered if he was in the grip of a nightmare. "Elle?" he asked. The doll stood for a few seconds more before slowly turning to look at him. The moonlight illuminated its features. The button eyes were enormous, bulging from its head, and its stitched grin had stretched impossibly wide, revealing uneven teeth that didn't look like fabric anymore. The nose had grown, and the doll, remaining silent, turned fully to face him, its movements awkward and unnatural. Tommy stood frozen to the spot, his breath caught in his throat. Doll's head tilted left, then right, its eyes locked onto his. "Ellie?" he croaked, taking a shaky step back. The doll twitched, its limbs jerked unnaturally as it took a step toward him, the floor creaking under its substantial weight. "This isn't real," Thomas whispered, backing away until his back hit the wall. "You're not real." The doll began to move toward him. Thomas screamed and bolted from the kitchen, crashing through the front door, out into the cold night. The forest loomed ahead, dark and tangled mass of shadows. He didn't think, didn't look back, he just ran. Behind him, the doll followed. Its movements were exaggerated and awkward, as if it were trying to get used to its new body, but it made up ground quickly, its gangly limbs stretched unnaturally, propelling it forward with horrifying speed. The sound of its heavy, uneven footfalls echoed in Tommy's ears. "Stay the hell away from me," he shouted, his voice cracking as he stumbled over roots and rocks. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead. He had let himself get into terrible shape since the death of his wife, but fear drove him onward. The doll began wheezing. Then a sound, which resembled excited laughter, began to fill the air, but it wasn't the laughter of a human. It was something far worse, and he knew that it was mocking him, enjoying seeing his terror as he stumbled onwards. Tommy burst into a clearing, the moonlight revealing the towering trees around him. He turned, putting his hands on his knees to catch his breath. He felt exhausted. He scanned the area and saw no sign of the giant doll. He was trying to work out the best direction to move in when he saw its white head peeking at him from behind a large tree. Just one of its eyes visible before it shifted out of sight. "What do you want?" he screamed, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry for everything. Please, leave me alone. Just let me drink myself to death. Is that not enough for you?" The doll moved slowly from behind the tree and stepped into the clearing. Its movements were a little smoother now, more deliberate. It then raised a long pale finger and moved it side to side in a no gesture, its stitched grin widening impossibly. Tommy turned and began to run, and as he neared the edge of the clearing, he noticed that no footsteps were audible behind him. He stopped and turned, only to see the doll gliding towards him, its feet no longer on the ground, as it moved silently through the air. Eyes looking down at him, Tommy turned and willed his legs to reach the woodland, but before he broke the tree line, the doll floated down in front of him. "Please," he said, but in seconds, the doll had wrapped its arms around him, and then Tommy felt his feet no longer making contact with the ground, and he began to feel weightless. He realized that the doll was taking him upwards, and soon he was looking down at the canopy of treetops as he continued to move higher in the night sky. When they finally came to a standstill, the buildings below them were just dots. The air was freezing cold, and the doll's face, which was just inches from Tommy's, stared at him silently. "Elenor," he said, "I'm so sorry. Please, let me live. I'll be your better man, I promise." Doll's giant face was still, and its bulging button eyes stared into his. "You're always the gentle one," he continued. "I was the monster. Don't let the things I did to you make you like me. I love you so much." And for a second, Tommy sensed a change in the thing before him, the grotesque representation of what had been his petite, plain, but beautiful wife, and he knew that whatever that thing was, part of his wife was in there, and she was listening to him. But then the sound of multiple cracks snapped him back into reality, and as the pain racked from his torso, he realized that multiple ribs had been severely smashed by the monster's vice-like grip. It then simply let him go. Thoughts of regret flitted through Tommy's mind as the giant doll which floated in the night sky grew more distant, its big face looking down at him, watching his descent. Tommy had always wondered whether, when people fell from a great height, shock took over before they hit the ground, and the impact was therefore painless. But as his body smashed against the earth, he realized that the answer was a resounding no. As unbelievable pain filled every inch of his body, it took a few utterly agonizing minutes for life to fade out of him. It was an elderly couple, walking their dogs, who'd found Tommy's bloody, bent, and broken body the following morning. They knew who he was, and also the kind of man he had been, so there was no love lost at the discovery. But as the old man looked down at Tommy, and at the small item which lay upon his chest, he thought that the doll must have meant something to the deceased brute. And as Tommy seemed to have no family, and barely any friends, the elderly man saw to it that the abusive man and his doll were buried together, as even a monster like Tommy deserved some company.